Okay, hey loves. So today this lesson is about Venus retrograde and Lent, comparing Inanna and the Bible. So let's dive in. Right, so let's start by who is Inanna, right? Inanna is the ancient Sumerian goddess known as the Lady of Heaven. She's also known by Ishtar, by the Akkadians and the Babylonians, as well as Astarte by the Phoenicians. She's a goddess of love, justice, war, and fertility. This is both like the fertility of the land as well as the fertility of women for birth. And one of her most famous myths is of her descent to the underworld, right? And if you actually read all of the stories that we have of Inanna, the arc of her stories really does follow like the phases of womanhood as maid and mother and crone. I truly believe that this is where that came from. She's also featured in the Hulupu tree myth, which is one of the oldest creation stories that we have on record. And I was going to try to get into that in this presentation, but I don't know if we're going to make it there. It's definitely worth looking into. Maybe I'll make another slideshow on that one. And something important about Inanna is that her uncle, Enki, gives her all of the May, which we went over in the previous story of Inanna's descent. There's a whole story of Inanna that is dedicated to this process when Enki gives Inanna the May. And the May are the gifts of the gods to humans and society. And so he really passes everything on to a woman, which I think is really beautiful. And so let's see. So Inanna is Venus. The earliest symbols and images we have of Inanna date to the period of ancient Uruk, which was it's a city that is in now modern day Iraq. Her symbols date back to anywhere from 4000 to 3100 BCE. And there's sort of like two groups of her symbols. Her symbols were put on seals and ceramics. And this was when they would seal up produce and goods for storage in the big places that they would store all the wheat and all the food. And because, as Inanna was a goddess of fertility, back then there was no necessarily separation of church and state, right? So the state, everybody was, in reverence to Inanna because everybody wanted good, fertile soil to produce a good harvest. And so when they came to store the food, they honored her by sealing all of the things that needed to be sealed with her seal. So it's we had this civilization where, oh God, it's so loud. We have this civilization where everyone is in service to this goddess for fertility, and everyone is in agreement upon these cycles of life in reverence to a feminine deity. And to be honest, when you get deep into Inanna, really deep, she is represented with both feminine and masculine depictions, which is also really interesting. But, of course, she is mostly a feminine energy. And so then the second, and so these seals with the ceramics typically didn't have any sort of astral or star-like attributes. And then the second set of her images are images where it's her and a star and a sunrise or a sunset, right? Because Venus is always close to the sun, so you're always going to see Venus around sunrise or sunset. And so here is one of these more astral seals, right? We have this is the Star of Ishtar, so this is from more of a Babylonian heritage as opposed to a Sumerian. And they were both in ancient Mesopotamia. But you see here we have the crescent, the solar disk, and the star of Inanna. So this was an astral symbol of Inanna or Ishtar or Astarte. And this particular one comes from the 12th century BC. So that's about 1200 BC. And so Inanna is also often depicted as a sheaf or a bunch of reeds that are densely tied and kind of set vertically, where there's a loop and a surplus. This was found on the cylinder seals for the first time in Uruk it's somewhere between basically 3350 BC and 2900 BC. And we'll look at them over here now. See, these are images. These are some of the first images we have of Inanna, and it's this here, like this, this shape. These are the reeds and the bunch of surplus, and they're here, and they're here, and she's here. See, here. She is with the animals, and here she is on a boat. Let's see, like this one is a ritual feeding of the temple herd, right? Or a transportation of the altar decorated with a pair of Inanna symbols. And then this one's a ritual scene where a man moves the Inanna symbol holding a plate. I don't actually know what a plate is. But then, here, this is a pair of Inanna symbols. The gateposts at the sacred pen for cattle. So, like, they were really, like, she was very present and alive in their livestock, in their food, in their rituals, in their altar. And she was the symbol of Venus, right? And like here is an example of her in the cuneiform depictions before they moved into, I don't know if it was before necessarily, but these are depictions of Inanna in cuneiform, and then these are her more like pictographs, right? And like these are just like different versions of what she could have looked like. And so, like, even in her symbology, it is very rooted in reeds, in grain, in fertility, and specifically fertility in relationship to food. So, because Venus is always near the sun, right, she spends her time both as the morning star and the evening star, and she goes through a retrograde motion when she changes phases. So as the morning star, she's more linked with war and fertility, and I believe it's more like fertility of the land. And this is more of like Venus as the ruler of Taurus, right? Because Taurus is earth, fixed earth specifically. And then as the evening star, she's more linked to love and justice and fertility as in like sex fertility, right? As in like the woman's fertility to procreate. And this is more of Venus as the ruler of Libra, right? And it's said that when she's happy and in love and satisfied, she blesses and provides an abundance of crops. So everyone was on the same team to keep Inanna happy. And so the earliest record that we have of Venus comes from the Enuma Anu Enlil, we'll call it the EAE, which is a set of 70 cuneiform tablets that contain astronomical and astrological information. So this was the movement of Venus as well as omens related to Venus that priests divined. And these texts date back to 1500 BCE or over 3,500 years ago. And here's some examples of some of the tablets. And so these were made in clay, and then they were written in, and then I believe they were baked. So they've been able to stay well preserved, because even if they get hot or a fire, it just bakes them even more. So the truth is that I don't know if the retrogrades were actually written in these texts. It does seem like they were more about the heliacal rising and settings of Venus. And the heliacal rising or setting is basically, because Venus goes so close to the sun, so often there are some times when we can't see her. That's when she's in her katsimi, which, from my understanding, is when she's in the underworld. And the heliacal rising, for instance, is that first day that you can see her return before the sun rises. Or it would be, for the setting, it would be the last day you see her before she gets too close to the sun to be visible anymore. And this tablet 63, the tablet of, oh my God, I'm going to butcher this, Amisaduka. This is the specific tablet of Venus. And so this particular tablet dates to around 700 BCE. So just to kind of give some perspective, right? Cuneiform is the earliest evidence we have of written language, and that dates back about 3500 BCE. Anatomically modern humans are 300,000 years old, right? And so anatomically modern humans with modern behaviors date back to around 50 to 65,000 years old, right? So that means that there is at least 44,475 years of story told via oral tradition that is unaccounted for. And, potentially that number could even go up all the way to almost 300,000 years of story, of human story that is completely unaccounted for because it was all passed orally. So like what we're seeing here now is dating back to 4,000, 5,000 years ago at the oldest, when we're talking about a human history of at least 50,000 years that is in the astral. And, until recently, some scientists do actually believe that Inanna could be the precursor to the constellations, like the idea of subscribing this goddess to Venus could have then provided the inspiration to put on gods or deities or symbols to other constellations. Because often the Babylonians are credited most often with having developed the zodiac. And there's actually new research now where a lot of the cave paintings that they have been able to now study more deeply that date back to, as early as 40,000 years ago are actually references to the constellations via animals in the caves, like in the cave paintings. I have another presentation on that that will be coming soon. And so, but what could potentially be true is Inanna might be the oldest reference that we have of attributing like a more human-like god to a celestial body, because it does seem that in a lot of those cave paintings they were more animals. So this could be the first time that a more human-like figure or deity was associated with a celestial body. And so, Venus retrograde is 42 days, and the one that we are in right now is specifically 42 days. I think it might vary a little bit. I counted the days though, and the one that we're in is 42 days. And so I have some references here of just the number 42, right? And in 42 we have Ma'at. Ma'at is the Netzaru for cosmic order, cosmic justice, cosmic law coming out of Egypt. And she has her 42 negative confessions, which is what the heart is weighed against in the duat. So in the Egyptian cosmology, when we die, our soul goes through a journey of the duat. And sort of one of the climaxes of that journey is when your heart is weighed against a feather on the scales. And it's weighed against each one of 42 assessors. And your heart must be lighter than every of these 42 assessors for you to move on to the afterlife. Otherwise, you get devoured by Amit, which is not fun. And so that's a very strong example of 42, right? In the Zohar, which is Judaism's primary mystical text, this tells us that God's true name is 42 letters long. There's one letter for every step of life. So that's really fascinating to consider. We'll actually come back to that. Some other interesting things about the number 42 is, our body regenerates itself every 7 years. So 42 is 6 times of our body reproducing itself. The Gutenberg Bible is sometimes called the 42-line Bible because each page has exactly 42 lines. 42 is a pronic number, which means it's the product of 2 consecutive integers, 6 and 7. And in mathematics, 42 is the sum of the first 6 positive even numbers. So again, we have this relationship of 6. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And so I think this is really interesting, this idea of life as a journey of 42 segments. And I have not studied a lot of Judaism in my life. So this was really new for me. But the Torah outlines in Exodus, in the book of Numbers, there are 42 stops that the Jewish people must make during their 40-year journey through the desert. So there's this really interesting relationship between 40 and 42. Like, they are both very prominent numbers, which is really fascinating considering they're, only 2 numbers apart from each other. And the Baal Shem Tov adds that the 42 stations from Egypt to the Promised Land are replayed in the life of every individual Jew as one's soul's journey from its descent to earth at birth to its return to its source. So it's again this idea that, this is specifically in Judaism, but I do find it just interesting to consider for everyone, this idea of 42 segments or stations or stops on our journey of life. And it's also interesting to consider the 42 ideals of Ma'at, or the 42 negative confessions, being that's exactly what our heart is weighed against. So the English phrases 40 and 2 and 2 and 40, that was how they expressed the number 42 in the Bible. And it's recorded 14 times in 14 verses of the King James Bible. So we're going to come back to 42 and 14 because that's important. The Old Testament writings, it's mostly used in the book of Nehemiah, followed by Ezra and 2 Kings. But the only New Testament book to use the phrase is Revelation. So this is very this 42 is very much in the beginning and very much at the end. And then in Scripture, part of the meaning of 42 is derived from its direct connection to the coming Antichrist. His evil efforts will last for 42 months in the end time, and thus it's firmly associated with him. In the book of Revelations, it does prophesy a time where the Antichrist will reign for 42 months. And again, I just find this to be very fascinating, this deep tie with, Revelations and the apocalypse and all of this, considering that 42 is actually at the heart of our journey through the Duat when our soul is judged. That's just really fascinating to me. And so coming back to 14, right? So the numbers 14 and 42 are very directly linked to Jesus Christ in the Gospels, right? So Matthew's Gospel outlines Jesus's entire lineage. You can go look it up. And it's essentially 3 sets of 14, which equals 42. And it's funny, though, because I actually looked this up, and I looked this up in different versions of the Bible and also the Torah, and none of them really actually even add up to 42. But it says, it is explicitly written in the Gospel that it is 3 sets of 14, right? But that's not, when you actually count them and lay them out, I couldn't find one that was perfectly like that. So it's really fascinating that this number was called to, even though the math wasn't actually written to be correct. I feel like that makes it actually even more important, because it's reading between the lines. A lot of these ancient texts, including the Bible, there is a lot of reading between the lines. There's so much symbolism even in what's not written, or even in things that might have purposefully not added up the way that they seem like they should. But what's really important about this, and Jesus's lineage specifically, is it goes all the way back to Abraham. And so from Abraham to King David is set 1, right? And then set 2 begins with King Solomon. And apparently, according to a lot of the research I was doing about this, is important. One of the things that Matthew was specifically doing was connecting Jesus's lineage to King Solomon to help sort of position him as a king, as a descendant of a king. That's part of why a lot of scholars believe, because this opens up Matthew's gospel, this lineage of Jesus. So this was incredibly important. But it goes from King Solomon to Josiah, which is when the exile happened, when the Jews left Egypt. So there's this really deep connection too between Jesus and the exile of the Jews. And then this next set is Iconiah to Joseph, Jesus' father. That's set 3. And that's the set from, basically what Josiah is when they were exiled, or when they left. And then set 3 is like from the exile to Joseph. And so this also brings about the number 7, right? Because we've got 14, we've got 42, but then when we take it down, again, we have 7. And 7 is an incredibly important number in the Bible and the Torah, right? Because God creates the world in 6 days. And on the 7th day, he rests, right? And so 7 represents completion. And 14 sort of represents double completion. And the number 42 is referenced 14 times in the Bible, in the Pentateuch and in Revelations. So the Pentateuch is essentially the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. And that is the same as the Torah. I don't know if it's the entire Torah, but I know that it's at least a part of it. And so it's in, the first 5 books, and then it's in Revelations. It's literally in the beginning and the end. And it's like not in the middle. And so just as this whole idea of it, of death and resurrection, I just find it to be so interesting that 42 is specifically referenced in the beginning and the end. And so, this brings us to 40 in the Bible, right? Because we do have 40 days of Lent. The number 40 generally symbolizes a period of testing, trial, or probation, right? It can also mean or symbolize a generation of man. So like Moses' life, for example, was of trial and testing. It can be divided into 3 blocks of 40 years. So the 3 stages of Moses' life, and this is also pretty connected to Jesus as Moses led the exile. From 0 to 40 was Moses in Egypt growing up with the Pharaoh until he slayed a man and he had to leave Egypt, right? And then from 40 to 80, Moses was a shepherd in the wilderness, hiding out after he killed a man in Egypt. And then when Moses reaches 80, at the end of his second 40 years, that's when God calls Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And so from 80 to 120, Moses is wandering the desert. He's like leading the Israelites out of Egypt and wandering the desert. And then additional to Moses, or with Moses, he went up to Mount Sinai on 2 separate occasions for 40 days and nights to receive God's laws, right? When he received the 10 Commandments, for instance, when he met I don't think that is actually when he met the burning bush. No, he did meet the burning bush on Mount Sinai. Anyways, we can go into that later. Moses also sent spies for 40 days to investigate the land that God promised the Israelites as an inheritance. And that also comes from the book of Numbers. So like a lot of the book of Numbers, the book of Exodus, it's like the book of Revelations, a lot of these books, a lot of this information keeps coming from the same books. And so here's more references of 40 in the Bible. Elijah went 40 days without food or water at Mount Horeb. Jesus was tempted by the devil 40 times Jesus was tempted by the devil many times during his 40 complete days he fasted at the start of his ministry. After Jesus' resurrection from the dead, he appeared to several groups of people over a period of 40 days. And then God flooded the earth by having it rain for 40 days and 40 nights in Genesis with the flood. And then after Jacob died in Egypt, the Egyptians spent 40 days embalming his body. So again, we've got references from Genesis here, which is the first book of the Bible. And then in the book of Exodus, in the King James translation, it's the only book that has 40 chapters. And then also in the book of Exodus, part of the reason that the Israelites had to wander the desert for 40 years is because basically an entire generation was sentenced to die. God basically said that no one that was over the age of 20 when they left Egypt, when they left bondage and slavery, was going to be allowed to enter the promised land. So they literally had to wander the desert for 40 years to wipe out an entire generation. And that's like so wild. It's so wild. That's like sounds awful. And then, so Jesus, days before his crucifixion in 30 AD, prophesies the total destruction of Jerusalem. And then 40 years after his crucifixion, the mighty Roman Empire destroyed the city and burned it to the ground, and burned his temple to the ground. So, I didn't actually fact check that, but that is according to the Bible. Okay, so just to kind of go back to the timeline of this, right? Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, the book that describes the creation of earth and man, that was written about around 500 BCE. And that was technically after the exile happened already, which is like where we get into Exodus and the book of Numbers. The Gospels about Jesus were written at around 30 to 40 AD. And then Revelations was written around 95 AD. So like in Genesis is where we have a lot of the references to 40, 42. It's really the whole Pentateuch. I don't know how long it took to write all 5 books, but that started around 500 BCE. And then Revelations, which also is referencing 42, was written around 95 AD. So they were written about 600 years apart. And then the Enamu, Anu, Enlil, which has the omens of Venus, was written around 1500 BCE. And the symbols of Inanna are appearing around 4000 BCE. So like the symbols of Inanna are, 3,500 years older than when Genesis was written. I just think it's really interesting to consider the timelines of these different things and just how much older a lot of these Mesopotamian writings are. And so the numbers 7, 40, and 42 are all important numbers in relationship to creation, exile, Jesus, and Revelations, right? And Inanna is the 7th of the divine powers in her cosmology. She's the 7th of the 7, right? Of the gods. It goes Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and then Inanna. And so this idea of the 7 of 7, the 7s being important, that predates the Bible and the Torah, where 7 is very important. So I just found that to be really fascinating. And in terms of Venus's cycle, right, it takes Venus 8 years to go through 5 cycles or 5 star points, right, because there's 5 points on her star, which means that each cycle is 40 years to go through all 5 star points. So here we have a very direct relationship between 40, because it's like 40 years of one complete 5 star point cycle, or 42 days of one retrograde cycle. And a new cycle begins 144 degrees earlier in the zodiac than the previous year. There was something really significant about the number 144 in the Bible. I have to go back and find it because I think I forgot to add it in here. But so then when we come back to Venus retrograde, right, we've got 21 days to Katsimi from when Venus starts her retrograde moment, and then 21 days to direct motion, because the Katsimi happens right in the middle. So that's 3 sets of 7, right? And then 6 times 7 is 42, but then it's like divided into these 2 sets of 3 7s. And so coming back into Lent, Ash Wednesday to Easter Sunday is technically 46 days if you count those days. But a lot of traditions, I believe, don't count Sunday as days. And I imagine that's because Sunday is the day of rest. But also, Lent technically begins on Ash Wednesday and it ends on Good Thursday. So Good Thursday is the day before Good Friday, right? Good Friday is the day that Jesus was crucified on the cross. That's the day he was hung on the cross. And then Easter Sunday is the day that he resurrected. That's the day that Mary Magdalene came to the cave and found him resurrected. And she was the first person that Jesus revealed himself to. And what's fascinating is Easter Sunday is the 7th Sunday after Ash Wednesday. And I think, that seems very purposeful. So that was a lot of really technical information. I still don't fully know what to do with all of it myself. But there's just very clearly this very direct relationship between Venus, the numbers 40 and 42, as well as the Bible and resurrection and descent and death and rebirth. Inanna's story of descent to the underworld is at least 3,000 years old. And it is significantly older than Jesus' descent into the underworld. And there's quite a lot of parallels, right? Including that Inanna was dead for 3 days, the same way that Jesus was dead for 3 days. And, it really even gets so much more fascinating when we get into the story of Inanna and the Halupu tree as the creation story of ancient Mesopotamia, and a lot of the relationship between that story and the story of Genesis. So I'll have to make another presentation to dive into that, because that also kind of brings even more of this ancient Mesopotamian symbolism into the Bible and the Torah. But for now, I will leave you with this. Please let me know what you think in the Skool group. Let me know what stood out, any reflections you have, any curiosities, anything you want to learn more about. I would just love to hear how this information sits with everyone. Thank you so much.